Well, thank you everyone for joining me today for Smart Form Building, our free training session. Today is November 19th, 2014, and we will be covering building smart forms. Usually I have a host going through this with me, but today I'm just by myself. So if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the question box, and I'll be answering them as we go through it. For some of you who don't know me, my name is Berit Johannesson, and I'm a solutions engineer here at iFormBuilder. And it's a wonderful product that we have. So if you're brand new to iFormBuilder, hopefully this is a great way to get some more exposure and to learn more about the form building process. Before we begin, we do have some upcoming iFormBuilder events. These are 2 free training webinar sessions, just kind of like what you're attending today. The next one is on December 10th, 2014, and that session is on iFormBuilder for engineering. So if you're someone who's in the engineering or GIS field and you're interested in using the platform in that capacity, I highly suggest signing up for that training session. The other session here is on December 17th, and that's on data understanding and integrating iFormBuilder data with third-party integration tools. Both of these links can be accessible after this webinar. I'm going to take this recording and take these screens and make them into a PDF and put them on a website and share that link with you. And so from there, if you go into the PDF, you'll be able to link to these sites to be able to sign up for the training sessions. All right, so to start, we're just going to go through our training topics. Today, we're just going to start with an overview of smart controls. From there, we're going into how to add simple functions to a form. The third topic today is to display the user's input or selection. Next, we'll go into the adding functionality to an option list, and then our iFormBuilder built-in functions. If you are new to the platform and you're new to adding these smart controls, this is a great course for you to be a part of, just because we are going through the basics of smart controls. So let's go through our best practices for form building. The first one here is to use a naming convention for all forms. This is especially important for your FormBuilder account. If you've been using FormBuilder for a while and you don't have a naming convention, you may notice that sometimes it's hard to find what subform is associated to a parent form. So this is where I use the naming convention _parent and _child to be able to identify what forms are connected. Before I go on, I'm actually going to show you what my FormBuilder account looks like so that you have some idea on how the naming convention can really come in handy. Okay, so as you can see here, I have Android end user evaluation _parent, and then Android end user training evaluation _child. So this is where I can identify all the forms that are connected through the subform and parent and child and subform relationship. And this goes throughout my form building account, and so again, it's just a way that I'm able to identify and quickly find the form that I'm looking for. Next is the tip to always have a device handy while you're building your forms. This is especially important when you're adding smart controls, because you'll want to test to make sure that your JavaScript is accurate. And so by having your device handy, that'll make your life a little bit easier. The third practice is to clean your local database if in the iForm app if something doesn't quite look right on the form. If you're unfamiliar where clean local database is, it's right under where you log in. If you're using an Android device, it'll say empty local database. One thing to note is make sure that you've synced all your data to the cloud before you clean your local database, because it does wipe out everything. The next best practice is to test on all device types before going live. So if you've noticed, if you use an Android device or if you use an Apple iOS device, with the iForm app, there are mostly everything similar, but there are some differences. So make sure you test on both the Android and iOS if that's what your users are going to have access to, but also make sure that you test on your smallest device type. When you are using our select option list and some of our other input types, it will look a little bit different on the smaller devices. So make sure that you see how it fits there, especially the text. The next best practice we have for form building is to open multiple browser windows for convenience. So what you probably would have noticed when I shared my screen and shared my browser window before, I had about 3 different windows open. This really helps when you're using either the Smart Table Search. The next practice is to add the required fields once the form is complete. That's just a preference on my end, and that's just so that I can submit the form whenever I'm completed and testing it out. Then we have to remember that only the parent form needs to be assigned. With that, keep in mind that every form that you build will automatically be assigned to you, and so there may be times where you'll want to unassign a subform. That's done through the form assignment. Lastly, here we have the follow the iForm Builder golden rules. If you're unfamiliar what those golden rules are, I'll be covering that in just a moment. Oh, there's our moment. Here we are. So our first golden rule here is to test before going live. We can't stress that enough. That's because when you're adding JavaScript and you're adding smart controls to your form, you have to account for some human error. So you want to make sure that you test them before you're in an area where you won't have connection to make any edits to those forms. Our second form building golden rule is to use unique data column names that are database friendly. So if you are familiar with building out forms, you may have noticed that some terms like location, if you place location in your data column name, then you won't be able to save your form. And if that happens, you'll have to refresh your window, reopen that form, and then uncheck the box that says, underneath it where you place the data column name, you'll uncheck the box that says based on label, and then you can have location for what the user sees, but maybe location underscore of user for your data column name. Our third form building golden rule is to make sure that you do not change an input type, data size, or encryption for an element on a live form because it will delete the data. All right, everyone say that with me because I want to make sure it sticks with you. So do not change the input type, data size, or encryption for an element on a live form because it will delete the data. We want to make sure that at all times you have the data that you need and that this is not a problem. You do find that you have to change the input type on a live form. Instead of changing it, disable that element and then add a new element, a copy of that element underneath, and then make the changes that you need. That way you don't lose any data and you're able to make the change of the form that the user has. Okay, so now we have our overview of smart controls. We're going to cover what are smart controls, why you should use them, what they can be used for, and what are some tips. So first, what are smart controls? Smart controls add functionality to the form, and you use basic JavaScript to this. Why would you use smart controls? Very simply, our whole goal here is to cut down on human error, and using smart controls can do that for you. You can also cut down on human interaction with a form. The last piece here, we have some helpful JavaScript tools. I strongly suggest looking into the W3 schools. So if you're brand new to iForm Builder and building out these forms, here is a quick definition of the different types of smart controls that we have. So the first one, for the dynamic label, you use JavaScript statements that can be strict or conditional to set the value of the element. So keep that in mind. That's dynamic value is setting the value of the element. Condition value, when the statement evaluates as true, the element will display on the device. Otherwise, it will remain hidden. So this is, when I think of the condition value, I usually think of how do I want that specific form field to show up to my user? Do I want to hide it all the time? Or do I want to maybe show it based off a selection that they have, or based on an input that they place within the form? Then underneath the condition value, we have the dynamic label. For the dynamic label, you use JavaScript statements to specify the label of an element. What a lot of folks will do is they'll use the dynamic label to place a response from the user in another question. So for instance, if I were to ask, what is your favorite hockey team? For my first question, and you respond, the Pittsburgh Penguins. Underneath that, I could have a question saying, why are the Pittsburgh Penguins your favorite hockey team? So you're able to place the response and make it a more personable experience. Underneath the dynamic label, you have the client validation. For the client validation, you use custom validation logic to restrict a record from uploading unless certain values are entered. So what some people will do is they'll tell their users that they have to select a number between 1 and 10. And if for some reason that user tries to place in the number 11, then they would receive a validation message, an error validation message. And that message is placed in the validation message in the bottom section of your smart controls, and you place that in quotes. Okay, so that's a really high-level overview on the different types of smart controls that you have. More often than not, a lot of your functionality will occur in the dynamic value and the condition value. So what smart controls can do? These are just some examples. Basically, anything you can do with JavaScript, you can add into your smart controls for iFormBuilder. So these are just a couple of examples. The first one being that you can show or hide elements based on a user input. A lot of times people will do that based off of a selection from an option list, then they'll maybe show a text area underneath. You can default elements. So maybe you want to default an element to always have a specific email address. So if you want to do that, you could place the default in the dynamic value. You can add mathematical calculations. A lot of folks will want to have a total at the bottom of their forms. So this is that you can do with our smart controls. You can also add a hard returns in a text area to create a list based off of a user's input. Then you can validate the user input with our validation or with our client validation. You can concatenate multiple elements into one element, and you can do subform aggregation. If you're unfamiliar with some of this, I will be showing you a demo of what it looks like, what some of these functionalities look like on the iPad, as well as how I did that within the Form Builder. As we continue with our overview of smart controls, here are a few tips. The first one being that you must use the element's data column name in the smart controls. So sometimes people run into problems because they try to use the label of the element instead of the data column name. So make sure that you're selecting the data column name. Then for the table name and page level JavaScript, this is located in the Edit Form Properties page. So if you're going through some of our Customer Success Center articles and it tells you to get the table name or to place some kind of code in the page level JavaScript, that's located in the Edit Form Properties page. Another tip is to use page level JavaScript for more in-depth JavaScript functions. So this allows you to, if you're familiar with JavaScript, this allows you to add variables and allows you to have a large section for your page level Java or for your functionality to occur. And the last step here for our overview of smart controls is to use the following to add the multiple conditions to an element. So this is how you would use AND. So for instance, if you have a pick list and you want an other field to show up if they selected field number 2 and field number 3, then you could use the ampersands for your conditional statement. This is how you do OR. And lastly, with the 2 equal sign, that's the way to check if something is equal to something else. And here at the bottom, use the lowercase f and have false in the condition value. It'll hide the element from view on the device for the user. Now I'm just going to bring up a demo to show you what it looks like on the device. Okay, so you should be able to see the iPad on my screen. I'm just going to go into the iForm app. And I want to sync my device to make sure I have the most up-to-date form. And actually, if I go back, if you guys aren't familiar with our newest update with iOS 8, you've probably noticed that the structure's changed, but also notice that there's this little information button in the bottom corner. By pressing that, this pops up and it tells me that the Smart Controls demo form for November 2014. It gives me the version as well as if I press the version, it gives me when it was modified and created by. And I can just press the open button from here. Here I've just included a little icon at the top. This first example is our concatenation of elements. So the user is just placing their first name, last name, and date of birth. For this, I did default the keyboard so that it would be a number pad. Now you can see underneath that it has my full name and a birth date. That's in a read-only field. So this was concatenated from the 3 fields above. Underneath that we have our client validation. So next scheduled visit. If I select today, then I received that error message popped up rather quickly. Let's see if we can get that again. It says error, please enter future date. So that was the message that I had placed in there for the validation message. So now I have to go back into that form field and I'll select December 19th, and now that error message doesn't pop up. Underneath that we have the show element based on our user's input. So if I select, the question is, was there any broken equipment in the lab? If I select non-applicable, nothing happens. If I select no, nothing happens. If I select yes, then I have 3 fields that have now shown up. One was what was broken, and I'll just say a lamp. Underneath that, I've used the dynamic label, and so it says, does lamp need to be replaced or repaired? So I can say replace or repair. And then I've defaulted this to say, to place it in my email address, so the user won't have to place that information. If for some reason they wanted to send an email to someone else, I did make this a text area, so they could go into that field and change the email address. Underneath this, I've used the Smart Option List and the ZZ Display Value. Another new update that we have is that you can use the ZZ Display Key, but for this example, I wanted to make sure I used the ZZ Display Value. So the question is, what is the focus of the exercise today? So if I select Lift, you won't see a change here, but if I go to what type, it'll say arms, legs, and other. Now if I go back and I go to speed and agility, then it'll say jump, skip, hand-eye coordination, and other. Let's just choose hand-eye coordination here. Then you can see using our ZZ Display Value, it's placed the hand-eye coordination in a read-only field underneath. So let's go into the iForm Builder built-in functions. The first one is to just display the username. This is another way that you can be smart about your form building and make sure that you're keeping your user accountable for the forms that they create or for the forms that they complete. Underneath that, I've used a subform to do subform aggregation. And I've just realized that I may not have updated my table name, so this subform aggregation may not work, but I'll walk you through how it would work, and I can fix my form so that it does work. So what should happen is, because I've created 2 different records, it should take the totals, the sums, and the averages and place those in these 2 fields underneath. Now, like I mentioned, I do need to update my form because the table name, because I copied my form, needs to be updated, and we'll do that in just a moment so you can see what that looks like. Below, I have some additional functions, and one is using our third-party widget. Here I've set this up to send an SMS to this specific phone number. So just opened up the text message area, and I can send that message to my user, and once I am done, I can just reopen iForm. You can set up that third-party widget with so many different options. And if you're unfamiliar with it, I strongly suggest looking into it on our Customer Success Center. And I do have a link to it on our page, but it's a really powerful tool. Under the third-party widget, we have the Smart Table Search. And here I've already created the Smart Table Search. So if I place in the number 2, then the name of the product is automatically populated based off of that selection. So if I go back and I place in the number 1, you'll notice that when it said Sony before, now it says iPhone 5. Lastly here, I have a multiple picture subform element. So this is just another way to be smart about your forms, especially if you are going to use photos within your forms. It does make sense to have a multi-link subform. Here I'm just going to take a picture with the camera. I'll use that photo. Or if I want to use annotation, then I may want to take another picture. Here's a picture of my glasses. And I can use that as the background image. And then I may want to take another picture and use that as a floating image. So I'm taking a picture of my iPad on the computer. And I'll use that photo. I'll use that as a floating image. And I can resize that and move it around. I just wanted to make sure I showed you the annotation feature just to see if that's something that, just to make sure you guys are aware of that and to see if that's something that you want to use in your forms. Okay, so now that I've given you a quick example of some of the smart controls, I want to show you how you can use them and how to build them out for your own use. Okay, so that demo form I had, this is just the list of everything that I had in there. And so adding the smart controls or the JavaScript, this is just going through the dynamic label, the ZZ display value, the client validation, how to do calculations and concatenation. So the first step here is to default elements. These are 2 different ways that you can default your element. You can use the data column name and have that equal to 0. Or in what I call the swirly brackets, you can use those and place in 0 there. The reason you would want to do this, especially if you're going to use a subform with calculations and the subform aggregation, that way, by defaulting the element to 0, it won't carry over any of the numbers that were placed in the form previously. In the form that I just showed you with the subform aggregation and where I had the calculations, I did default all of my elements to 0. Here's a list of other ways to default some of our elements. This is just for your information, and again, this will be in the PDF so that you can use this as a reference later on. One thing we don't usually think about is the masking widget. So we have 3 different types of elements with masking. One being the social security number, one being the zip code, and the third being the phone number. A lot of times I'll use these different masking elements for other cases than just the social security number, the zip code, and the phone number. So here, these are your different options for customizing a mask. And an example would be to use the social security number element for a birth date. I use this all the time, and it makes the life easier. You don't have the user scrolling through the date to try to find their date of birth. Next, we have our math calculations and concatenation. The reason that these 2 types of JavaScript are placed on the same presentation page is because they're so similar in the way that you have this action occur. When you're doing the basic math functions, you'll use the squirrely brackets, and then in between the squirrely brackets, you'll use the data column names for the elements that you want to add, subtract, multiply, or divide. Concatenation is the same idea. So you have the squirrely brackets, and then within the squirrely brackets, you use that data column name, and you add those together. So in the form, I did show you the dynamic label. Again, just a reminder, the dynamic label is used to display a user's answer from a previous element in another element. So for this example, the dynamic label in quotes says, "Thanks for taking the time to fill out this form today," and the end quotes, and then it says plus, and it's then including the user's name, which here the data column name for that field was first name 1. So then we have our display user input, our ZZ display value, and this is for our option list specifically. The first one, and then the second one is using the dynamic value. Following that is our client validation. So one example here is that the user needs to enter a value between 75 and 100. Another is that they need to select a specific option from an option list. And for this example, as you can see, is that they need to select a date, a future date, rather than today's date. Now let's go through and see what those fields look like in our form builder. So here we have first name, and that data column name is first name 2. We have last name 1 is the data column name. Like I said, I then use the social security number for the date of birth. So for the input properties, I selected social security. I made the mask, that structure that I wanted to follow, which was month, date, and then year. And then I used the number pad so that the user didn't have to go through the text first. Underneath that is what I have that I where I concatenated all those responses. So in the smart controls, I had the squirrely brackets, and that's the first name 2 plus. And as you notice, I have this section that is just quotes with a space in between. This is so that the first name and last name do not run together. So keep that in mind when you add in some of your JavaScript, especially if you're using sentences. And so first name plus, and then my space, then last name plus, and then what I did is I had a comma. So I wanted to break up the first and last name with the date of birth. So then I used my last data column name, which was the third element here, and I closed my squirrely brackets, and that was it. So it's a very simple process. Then we have our client validation. So for this specific workflow, what I needed to do is I need to have an element before my client validation element that was hidden from the user. So I did that, and I had it defaulted to today's date. And then as you can see in my conditional value, I had this false, so that, like I said, the user doesn't actually see this element. They only see the next scheduled visit. Once I go down to the next scheduled visit, you see I do not have any information in the smart controls for the dynamic value or the condition value. This is where my client validation came into play. This is saying that they need to select a date in the future. So this is just basic JavaScript. And this is the next scheduled visit is the data column name for this field. And then today's date is the data column name for the above field. So it's saying this needs to be greater than today's date. And then the validation message, always in quotes, is what is displayed in that error message that popped up. All right, our next session is to show an element based on the user's input. And this is where earlier I did mention using an option list. So here I have my select option list. Notice I don't have anything in the smart controls for the select option list. It's what follows, which was what was broken. For this what was broken field, in the condition value, it says broken equipment equals 0. So this is referring to this element here. And if I actually go into that option list in my option list manager, so yes is actually, the key value for that is 0. So it goes 0, 1, and 2. So that's why in my smart controls, I start with the number 0. So saying if the user selects yes, then show this field. Every other field, keep this hidden. Then below that is my select option list where I've used the dynamic label. Again, I have this field hidden unless that user selects yes for the broken equipment. And I've used the dynamic label, and in quotes I have does plus the data column name, what was broken, so that text area right above it, plus, and then need to be replaced or repaired. So this was just a way that I was able to use the user's response, refer to it in a follow-up question. Below the dynamic label, I have the send email to. So what I've placed in here, I've defaulted that element to my email address. So if you always are going to have an email sent to the same location, then this is what you want to place that email address here so that you don't have to worry about the user maybe putting in a wrong letter into that email address. And again, you'll see in my condition value, I have hidden that form field, so that's why it's set to 0. Unless they choose that broken equipment. Then we have our smart option list and ZZ display value. So our smart option lists are sometimes called our segmented option list. And what these do is based off of the user's first selection will depend on what shows in that second option list. So here is our first question. What is the focus of the exercise today? And if I go into my option list manager, it just says lift, speed, and agility. Now, in my option list manager, I don't have any condition values placed for that option list. I want to point that out because what you'll notice in this what type, which is the second option list, it depends on what the user selects. If it's lift, speed, or agility, then in this option list manager, I've added conditional values to say only show arms, legs, and other if they select the first option, which was lift, and then only show jump, skip, hand-eye coordination, and other if they select speed and agility, which is the second option. But of course, like I said, you always start with 0 for the values, the index value of the different options. One thing I want to point out too is that your key value always has to be unique. So as you can see here, I have other listed twice, but I've changed the key value so that those are always unique. Then we have our ZZ display value, what type. So what type is referring to this pick list, and that's just displaying the text of the user's selection. So then we have our built-in functions, and this is where I said that I needed to go back and change my subform aggregation table name because this has changed my table name because I did make a copy, so keep that in mind. And I will actually go in and copy this form. So this is the table name, save, and I need to make that change here. So for this built-in functionality, I have the iFormBuilder.math.average. So this is finding the average totals of all of the subform responses. So make sure you keep in mind that you have to have multiple responses for aggregation to occur. So I have iFormBuilderMath.sum and the iFormBuilderMath.average. Then I've placed the table name of this form. Then it's the name, so subform to aggregate totals. So the data column name of the subform element. So there we have the subform to aggregate totals. And then actually in the subform, what that field is called. So that one was called addition, and this one was called multiplication. Save my form. This is just another way to look at it, and I've mapped out the steps on how to use that subform aggregation as well. Besides just the iFormBuilderMath.sum and the iFormBuilderMath.average, we have iFormBuilder.username as well as getNextSequence. iFormBuilder.username is what I showed you, and that's a way to have your users stay accountable, and it just displays their username of the person that signed into the device. And then the getNextSequence allows the user to keep track of how many records they have provided. So now at the bottom of this specific form, I've added those additional functions. So we have our third-party widget. This is really easy to use, and it's just by going into input properties, selecting third party, and here I set it as SMS and then the phone number that I wanted to have it send a message to. Again, you can do FaceTime, you can do a phone call, you can open Google Maps. Your possibilities are really endless. And we have on our help desk article about this, we do have a link to pages that will give you different URL schemes that you can use for this. Then I used our smart table search. So this is when I was going through the example for this, this is where I placed either number 1 or 2, and depending on what I placed for 1 and 2, showed a read-only field with those responses. The way you set up a smart table search is really easy once you get the hang of it. So here I'm going to open my smart table search database. And what I've done here is I have my 2 bottom fields, so I have a unique identifier and the name of product. And the table name here is demo_smart_search_database. I use that form and that form name for the smart table search. So for this unique identifier, I go down to smart table search and I place that table name. The column name that I use is from that database form that I previously created. And this is the data column name that I have, unique identifier. Again, this is what you'll set up as the way that whatever the user will place in that information, and based on the information they place in here will depend on what shows up in that read-only field. So now that I've set up the smart table search, underneath that and all the applicable fields that use that smart table search, I've placed the following in the dynamic value. So here's the table name for that database that I've created. And this is the element in that table that needs to populate this form. So name of product, and the data column name. I had copied that, and I did, after I had the table name, I did a period, and then I placed that element name. Again, it's very simple to do. Okay, so as we wrap up, here are other ways that you can add more to your forms and add more functionality so you can really cut down on that human error. All right, so after this training session, I'll send over the recordings and I'll post this. And if there are any questions, feel free to reach out to me at bjohannesson@xerionsoftware.com. I want to thank you so much for spending time with me this afternoon, and hopefully you found it helpful. If there's anything else I can do, just please let me know.